Welcome to the Know Your Rights podcast, an access to justice production by the Maricopa County Library District and Office of the Public Defender. Join our group of attorneys, librarians, and community partners each week as we chat about the laws that affect you and your legal rights. Please note, this podcast does not serve as legal advice, but as general information about the legal system and current laws. Listen each week to empower yourself with knowledge and know your rights.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this week's episode of Know Your Rights. We are in the middle of our domestic violence series. October was Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And we are talking about really domestic violence and what the criminal justice process looks like, what victims' rights are. And we're also talking next week about defendants, what they need to know. So before we get started, I did want to do a content warning. This episode will contain discussions about domestic violent crimes and offenders. So, if you want to skip this series, if you're not ready to hear it, you can join us again November 15th, and we'll talk to the Arizona Humane Society. We'll be on a different topic then. If you need help regarding domestic violence, you can call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-656-SAFE. That's 7233. But this episode will always be available in our back catalog, so you can listen when and if you feel ready. Okay, so let's get started. I'd like to introduce our guests, Laura Lopez and Mark Jansen. Laura, will you introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me. My name is Laura Lopez, and I am a victim advocate with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. I'm also the Victim Services Division trainer, and I assist victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and survivors or next of kin on homicide cases. And as an advocate, I help victims navigate through the criminal justice system and help them exercise their statutory right. I have been with our office since 2014, and prior to that, I was an investigator for CPS or DCS, and worked as an advocate for several nonprofit agencies.
Thank you, Laura. And Mark, will you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me. I am a prosecutor with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office here in Phoenix, Arizona. I've been prosecuting in this office for over 9 years now, and about the last half of that, I've been in one of our two family violence bureaus. We have an East and a West bureau, and I'm in the East bureau. And mostly that just means geographically I handle cases mostly on the east side of town. I've been prosecuting in this bureau felony level domestic violence cases up to and including homicide cases. We handle domestic violence cases that involve anything from different types of aggravated assaults to forms of harassment or stalking, repeat domestic violence offenders. We also prosecute child physical abuse cases and neglect cases, as well as some vulnerable adult cases as well.
Thank you. So, Laura, I know last episode you kind of gave us like a brief overview, but I was hoping you could go, a little more in depth and really tell us what exactly victim advocates do.
So victim advocates are highly trained and experienced professionals who assist victims and families currently involved in the criminal justice system. In addition to providing important emotional support, the victim advocate also assists with any social service needs. They serve as a liaison with the prosecutor handling the case, and they provide case-related information or updates on the criminal justice system. So victims of crime in the Maricopa County are assigned an advocate, and the advocate keeps the victim informed of the progress of their case and works to ensure that the victim's rights are honored throughout the criminal justice process. So a few duties that the advocates do perform is we do explain victims' rights, and we also assist victims with exercising those rights, provide hearing notification. And again, we are the liaison between the prosecutor and the victim. We are normally that point of contact to allow the prosecutors more time to focus on the case, alert the prosecutors of any victim needs, provide court accompaniment to hearings or interviews. We also convey plea agreements, obtain input on motions to modify release conditions, change of pleas, any short notices, provide that support and crisis intervention to victims, assist with restitution requests, attend trial preparations, coordinate interviews and meetings with the victims. We assist with any logistics for victim testimony if a victim is flying in for, let's say, trial testimony, coordinate emergency food boxes, utilities, housing referrals, provide community resource referrals, assist with safety plannings, and inform of processes such as orders of protections or injunctions against harassment. A few things that victim advocates do not do is we do not discuss specific facts of the case or receive evidence. If a victim does have any new information or they want to add anything from what they remember on the date of the crime, we always refer them to the case agent associated to the case, who would then perhaps do a supplemental report and provide that information to both counsel. But I also just kind of wanted to touch into our K-9 program. So we do have the victim advocates who are assigned to victims of crime throughout Maricopa County. However, we do have a specific program that I wanted to just briefly talk about. So since victims are often traumatized by the heinous crimes and intimidated by the criminal justice system, we do have members of the K-9 Victim Support Program. And those K-9s are Tori, Ellie, and Morgan. They do provide that calming, comforting support to victims throughout the criminal justice process. And the Arizona Revised Statute 13-4442 states that the court shall allow a victim who is under the age of 18 to have a facility dog if available to accompany the victim while testifying in court. And in addition, the court may allow victims who are over the age of 18 to accompany those victims as well. So these K-9s that we have here, they do have an advocate handler, but they also assist victims with any of the interviews or meetings related to their case. And these K-9s that we have here do go through extensive specialized training, and they could also be seen representing the office in several community events.
I love that. And, therapy dogs are really, you see them everywhere, right? I know that some of the police actually now have a first responder dog that goes with the first responders there for that very same reason, right? It's a calming influence in a crisis situation. And I know that you're part of Maricopa County, but there are other agencies maybe that have their own victim advocates. Do you coordinate with other advocates if they're involved in a case?
Absolutely. So the great thing about victim advocacy is that we do share that common goal, which is to offer that emotional support and victims' rights information to victims. And so with that said, as professionals, we must be mindful of the assistance and rapport that the victims have built with other advocates or the professionals on different teams. And remember that it's important to meet a victim where they're at. If they've already built that rapport or feel safe with certain advocate, let's say from like the city of Phoenix or city of Glendale, it is important for us to work as a team. So there have been times where I've received calls or emails from some of the city advocates, like let's say city of Glendale, Phoenix, Surprise, asking what certain court hearing means, or if a victim has a question, or if they can attend court as well and accompany the victim. So again, it is important to empower the victim, being a victim of a crime. So how can I help you participate in your case as much or as little as you would like? And if that means having an advocate from a different agency attend, then absolutely. We would just notify, the court if there is like a limitation on how many people can attend, and then always just provide the prosecutor a heads up as well. So nonetheless, it is important in the facilitation of justice to empower the victims to voice their thoughts throughout the case. And again, if that means having any other advocate from any other agency, we do welcome it. And I will say recently I did have the opportunity to attend a parole hearing in front of the Executive Board of Clemency. So there are advocates with the Arizona Department of Corrections, Reentry and Rehabilitation. And those advocates, I just saw a whole new rule. The case has already been closed and it was actual parole hearing. And those advocates were able to be present with the victims who would pretty much just talk about, their experience. And if a defendant did want to go on to parole, that advocate was that present force after, the case had been completed.
Thank you. And Laura, you said that victim advocates do cooperate with the prosecutors a lot. So Mark, can you tell us a little bit more about how you cooperate with the victim advocates?
I can also address this from the standpoint of how I think the best way to cooperate or to work with a victim advocate is to just to have a successful prosecution. And by successful, I mean, so that justice is done and so that victims, feel like their rights have been protected. And so for me at a basic level, we do have some things in place in our office, for instance, where certain information just automatically gets shared with advocates. When we do certain things in our database system for charging a case or creating a plea, we all get notice of hearings, and advocates are going to know, at certain times that they need to contact a victim to go over things like their basic rights or go over the contents of a plea agreement or certain hearing dates. However, I find, especially as a domestic violence prosecutor, that it really pays to be proactive in certain cases. And I think there are some cases that just by the nature of what happens, especially homicide cases or aggravated assault cases where someone has suffered a serious injury, where I feel like it's a little more incumbent me as a prosecutor to reach out myself, to introduce myself to victims or perhaps next of kin in the case of a homicide. And so in those situations, I will certainly get in touch with the advocate who's been assigned, make sure that they're up to speed on what's going on with the case, or maybe the basic facts of the case as we know them from police reports, and other maybe dynamics that are going on in the family situations that we can tell from police reports or in talking with detectives. I find that information is very important to share with advocates. And sometimes it's just a simple matter of shooting an email or getting on the phone with them to let them know that, hey, this might be a special consideration in this case, or I can tell that this victim is probably going to need certain resources, or there are certain things that a victim is dealing with that just need to be addressed in their life situation. So I find that that's really a best practice. So as a case is going on, I also find that, especially in domestic violence cases, I tend to want to know what a victim would like to see before I maybe even make a first plea offer. Now, sometimes we have, especially after the pandemic, we lost the ability to take a lot of cases to our county grand juries because of social distancing. For instance, the courts weren't able to have as many grand juries available to make probable cause determinations. So we had to send a lot more cases than normal to the early disposition courts, which ends up meaning we had to make some very early plea offers. And by early, I mean, you may have charged a case that happened 2 or 3 days ago, and you're already having to decide to make a plea offer to extend within the next couple of days to a defense attorney. And in those scenarios, especially on a more serious case, I find it's really wise to either myself reach out to a victim in some cases, or do it with an advocate, or just have the advocate reach out to say, hey, what would you like to see in this situation? And if they can get that feedback to me, that helps me decide what an appropriate resolution might be, or it helps me know if I need to talk with the victim to talk through a little bit more to say, hey, here's kind of how I'm seeing this situation. And maybe I don't think that, just probation is appropriate, or maybe a victim says, I don't even want to prosecute. And I might need to have a respectful conversation about why we might still proceed with prosecution, given our different duties as prosecutors. And so those are all important ways to work with a victim advocate. Sometimes, have them reach out for you. A lot of times I like to have them in a conference call with me. And then as the case proceeds, if there's important hearings, if there's a potential plea or a settlement conference where everyone gets together with a neutral judge to maybe, try and negotiate a plea. And certainly in preparation for a sentencing, it's just really smart, I think, for prosecutors to know whether victims want to be involved at those various stages and to know if they're going to show up. Because sometimes it might be better for you as a prosecutor to be there yourself rather than to have a colleague cover it for you, especially if you've developed a really good rapport with the victim. I would also comment on, I'm referencing largely here victim advocates that work for my office. I should also say that in my practice, especially with domestic violence victims, I've had a number of circumstances where I've had to work with the probation department, which is an arm of the court, and they also have victim advocates that they contract with that are not part of the county attorney's office. And so I've had opportunities to stay in touch with some of those individuals if there's ongoing problems or potential violations of probation terms. Sometimes I've had to coordinate with not only the probation office itself, but also advocates that are working with them in that post-conviction phase.
That makes a lot of sense. What happens if there are kids involved? That can get really complicated, especially if DCS gets involved, because then you have multiple court cases, you have multiple agencies. So how does that work?
If we do have a multiple victims on one case, they're usually just assigned one advocate within our office. It does get a little tricky when there's, multiple victims, and let's say that for the prosecution, some may, want to see maybe be more lenient towards defendant or defendant. So what we usually do is we can have another advocate come in and join or utilize what we call our court advocate programs if there's more than one victim and they need that facilitation, coming in and out of court. But we do try to have one advocate when it is multiple victims on one case. Cases that do involve DCS, we do have a DCS or case manager as well as a liaison who are also on the case to help us as well. And there's a huge number of victims, if not a lot of minor victims as well.
I'll add a couple things to that. So in cases where the Department of Child Safety gets involved, there can be some definite complications. And one thing to keep in mind is that, when a case is investigated, law enforcement certainly will contact DCS if a child is a victim themselves to a crime. And if it's, really serious, like if the case is actually a homicide of a child or some other really serious child abuse case, certainly DCS is going to get involved. And they even have a specific section of their own investigators that seem to specialize in cases that they know are going to also potentially have criminal charges. But DCS, they can have varying levels of involvement. Sometimes there's just simply the taking of a report. Let me give you an example. Maybe you've got a situation where a father commits a crime against mother, and maybe children are present in the home, but they aren't victims themselves to any offense, but maybe they witnessed an incident. So sometimes, let's say that father gets charged and he's in custody, or even if he's out of custody but charged, DCS may take a report as to that incident, and they may have their own investigators that even sometimes do their own attempts to, talk to parents in particular, and the children sometimes too. And if that happens, usually we're, as prosecutors on the criminal side, we're going to try and get a copy of their investigation as well, because there may be highly relevant information that both sides need to know from each other. But DCS can also institute their own, or start rather, their own proceedings in a separate court system. It's still part of Superior Court, but a parent, for instance, can be prosecuted for a crime under the criminal system and then simultaneously have what we might call dependency proceedings going on in another part of the Superior Court. And if that happens, the Attorney General's office, which is a whole other agency that represents the Department of Child Safety, they will be the attorneys that represent DCS in those dependency proceedings. And those proceedings have their own rules. Those judges may have other things that they might be able to ask or force a parent to do if they want to potentially be able to maintain their parental rights. And so when that happens, there can be some complications in terms of making sure that, for me as a prosecutor, that I know what's happening in that system, and vice versa. They may need to know from me what's going on in the criminal case. And for any victims or parents that have a kid who's involved in this system, they also just need to know that there may be simultaneous proceedings going on, and there's going to be different agencies they might have to speak with. And DCS has their own, caseworkers that they may have to be in communication with, in addition to whatever's going on in the criminal system.
That makes a lot of sense. And we have actually done an episode on dependency. So if anyone wants to go back and listen to it, we had someone from the Office of the Legal Defense talk about parents' rights and the process for parents if the parents are going through dependencies. I know I've heard of order of protections. What exactly is an order of protection?
Yeah, so orders of protection, I consider those to be in a classification of something we call restraining orders. And I say classification because an order of protection, generally under Arizona law at least, involves domestic violence situations such that the relationship between the plaintiff and defendant on the order of protection, they have a relationship that is sort of defined under our domestic violence statutes. That's generally when that type of restraining order applies. There are also injunctions against harassment, which is the same idea, but that tends to apply then where the relationship between plaintiff and defendant is not one of the domestic violence type of relationship. So maybe it's just, acquaintances or neighbors, or that might be like a witness versus an offender, as opposed to if, someone is married to another person and they try and seek a restraining order against them, that's going to be an order of protection. So restraining orders, generally, there's due process protections under these as well for the defendant in those circumstances. And a victim can initiate a process with a variety of courts. There's a way to do it through the city courts or justice courts and even our superior courts as well, where they can seek an order of protection. They're going to have to generally list out some prior incidents that form the basis for them to believe they need this restraining order. The court will review that, decide whether to grant the order. But there's other, like I said, due process rights of how the defendant has to be given notice of that order. It has to be served on them before it's considered to be in effect. And a defendant in that situation can also request a hearing to challenge the basis for the order of protection. And if that happens, they go to the appropriate court and they will have a hearing where both sides can testify or present evidence. And in those hearings, generally speaking, neither side has a right to an attorney. But if they have one available, they can certainly have an attorney represent them during those hearings. Me as a prosecutor, I'm not able to represent a victim during those hearings, but other attorneys that are paid, or if for some reason it's a family friend or someone who's willing to do it pro bono or for free, then they can assist a victim during those hearings as well. And then it's up to a judge to decide if that order of protection should stand or not. If it's granted, then it automatically should last for a year. There's a process to have them quashed. I often find that domestic violence victims will get an order of protection. And even though the defendant may be told they're not supposed to have contact with or go back to the residence, let's say, where they had been living together, I often find that one or both sides may not follow that order in the future. Again, I don't mean to imply that the victim would get in trouble, because if it's an order of protection that is granted against the defendant, they're the ones that have that legal restriction from having contact with the victim, such that if they violate it, they can be prosecuted for it. But yeah, if a victim, for whatever reason, sometimes they will decide to still have contact with the defendant. Maybe it's uninvited, but they decide to go along with it. Oftentimes, they may be convinced to go back and have that order of protection quashed. I will say that frequently we see that happen, and then unfortunately another incident will still occur, and that's very unfortunate. And I would just recommend that most victims, really look into resources before deciding whether or not that's a wise decision to make. But that's the basics of an order of protection.
Thank you. And I did just want to point out, too, that we had an episode with the Superior Court Law Library, and they have a special kiosk for order of protections that gets even fast-tracked to a judge. So I did want to point that out, too. So if you want more specifics about that, you can hear our episode about that, or just contact the law library, too.
And I think there's ways to petition for these online now. That especially came about during the pandemic, which was a good thing to see from my perspective.
And that leads right in. I'm assuming, has there been an uptick in domestic violence cases during the pandemic? I know, kind of heard about it in the news, but did you actually see it in your office?
Yes, we did. So I would say initially when the quarantine order happened, which was, in the spring of 2020, so starting around April especially, we had in our bureau, we had about double the number of aggravated assault submittals came in for us to have to review. And that lasted for a few months, and then it came back down and tapered off. So I think it's come back down to numbers that are closer to what they had been. However, what I will say is during 2020, we definitely experienced an increase in domestic violence homicides. And I think that is even likely continuing into this year, 2021. You may have heard the FBI recently announced that across the country, they saw roughly a 30% increase in homicides generally across the country from 2019 to 2020. And I think that trend is likely continuing into this year, but we don't know yet for sure. I know that the city of Phoenix Police Department has definitely been reported in the news to have had an increase in domestic violence homicides this year as well as last year. So yeah, there has been an uptick. I would also say that some of the severity of what has come in, again, this is just anecdotally from my experience and experience of some of my other colleagues in our bureau. Yeah, we did feel like we were seeing more weapons cases, meaning people that were not just committing simple assaults or doing other lower level aggravated assaults, but more people seemed to be pulling out guns and knives on each other. And that's a really disturbing thing to see, especially when there's kids in the home. And a lot of the homicides we've seen, there's been quite a few that have involved gun violence against both adults and children. And that's really sad for us to see. I also would say that for child abuse cases that we've seen come in, especially during 2020, there were less opportunities, for instance, for teachers to maybe catch some of the child abuse that was going on early on in the process. And so subsequently, some children were stuck in homes, and unfortunately, they were being abused for lengthier periods of time. And then finally, things might have gotten so bad that parents or caretakers realized they needed to take that child to a hospital. And so some of the cases we saw come in just seemed to be more severe. And again, I don't have statistics on that, but that's just what we feel we've experienced in our bureau.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Well, thank you so much for, kind of going over the whole process. I'd like to, always bring in some resources in every one of our episodes. So if you listen to all of our domestic violence episodes, you'll hear probably the same resources each time. But Laura, I think you have some resources for us. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. And I thank you for mentioning the law library. It is located here downtown. So oftentimes the advocates will assist the victims or accompany them to the law library. It could be before hearings, after hearings, and we do have also the deputies as well here, or if not, we can always contact one of our detectives with our office if victims, do not feel safe, going and coming from these court hearings. I also wanted to just mention the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and that is the 1-800-799-7233. We also do refer victims over to the Sojourner Center, and they offer the 24-hour crisis line. They do provide information on shelters and safety planning, which is very important important. And as Mark was touching upon earlier with the orders of protection, it is important for a victim to have that safety planning in place, because oftentimes, if a victim does go ahead and move forward with the order of protection, you see that maybe aggressiveness on the behalf of the defendant when they, or accused or suspect, when they find out that they're being subpoenaed, or not subpoenaed, but actually given an order of protection. So it's important to have that safety plan in place, because again, the actual order does not take into effect until they're actually served. We also have that New Leaf, and they are also an agency that helps with any assistance, financial assistance or case management to domestic violence victims. We also have the SRP Assistance Program. They actually help victims with their energy bills. We do refer out to St. Mary's Food Bank, and they also deliver emergency food boxes, hot meals, home delivery, mobile pantry food trucks. The AZ Coalition Against Domestic Violence, they also provide comprehensive safety assistance to victims, kids, counseling, financial referrals. We have the Family Advocacy Center, and they do provide shelter and emergency housing as well. We do also inform victims of the Address Confidentiality Program, and as well as the AZ Protective Order Initiative, or that AZ Point, to get that order of protection, just to mention a few.
So thank you for talking about that. And, we always tell people in our episodes that it's important to have some sort of a crisis plan. So just like you would have, a fire escape plan, you should have some sort of a crisis plan, whether it's, a known mental health issue, know what to do with your kids if you ever have a mental issue that could come up and make you unable to parent. So what would you recommend that people consider for their crisis plans?
I think when it comes to crisis plans, it is important to have, let's say, certain contact information or phone numbers memorized, have some sort of evacuation route, or maybe even just find different routes on how to get from point A to point B in case, something's happening or you have to take a detour. Also always have an extra set of keys, set of clothing. Who can you go to, in moment's notice? Where can you keep copies of important documentation, such as an extra copy of a birth certificate or a driver's license? Rehearse the safety plan as much as you can. Talk to others that you feel safe with. And if there are children involved, practice with them as well. And then just do little things such as keeping your cell phone charged or have an extra cell phone. I would say that we also do have a lot of great advocates with other agencies who are pretty much professionals when it comes to helping with orders of protections and safety plans. So they can also help a victim come up with something that is, specific to them. I think that's very important.
I would add that there are a lot of great resources out there for creating a safety plan. We had previously mentioned the National Domestic Violence Hotline. If you go to their website, which is thehotline.org, they have a whole guide, like an interactive guide to safety planning, where they address, everything from basics, to home, school, job considerations, technology considerations, children considerations, and the emotional aspect of, of what you're going to be dealing with. And I think that these are really important things that you can write down if you're, in a relationship where there's been domestic violence, or if you think that it's even a possibility, and if you are in a situation, especially where you feel isolated and have very few resources or people that you feel like you can reach out to. Man, there's just so much good information out there. I think there is also found, another safety plan. One other organization I'll reference is the Arizona Coalition to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, and they have a whole resource page. It also has a safety planning section, and I think they even had where I found like a PDF document to just fill out to address several areas. What to do for safety during a violent incident, safety when you're preparing to leave, safety in your own residence if you're having to consider that, safety, with an order of protection and kind of what to have in place after an order of protection might be served, and safety considerations for your job or when you're in public, or perhaps schooling for your kids. And again, this whole issue of safety with your emotional health. I think going through this, I've talked to so many victims, and you can just tell the PTSD that they're going through, and it can be hard to process through what's happening and have the ability to take positive steps in your situation. If you can think through these things ahead of time to have a plan in place, then you can just go through that list rather than having to be dealing with both the emotion of the situation and trying to think about, okay, what should I do? But if you have that list already there, it's just a matter of going through it. I think that's something I would really advise people to do if they've they've experienced domestic violence or think that they might be in a relationship where they're on the verge of it.
Oh, that's a really great point. And if anyone needs these resources and you didn't get them from the podcast, you can just email us here at the podcast and we will go ahead and email them to you or get you in touch with the resources. So you can email us here at podcast@mcldaz.org and we will definitely get you in touch with any of the resources that you need. You know, that's a lot for victims, but what happens if you have a coworker or a friend that you're concerned about, or, you know, it can be a really tricky situation. So what should people know or do, you know, if they're concerned about someone?
I would say if there is any concern, there's a few things not to do. You know, don't wait for that person to come to you. Do not pass judgment or blame or pressure that person. Give advice, perhaps. Don't do the victim blaming where you ask questions like, why don't you just leave? And I'm sure this isn't the first time it's happened. So ways that we can assist is, you know, talk to that person, you know, offer any support, and it's ultimately their decisions. You know, if there are those safety concerns, maybe speak with them and provide those resources or talk about safety plans. But again, do not pass judgment. Let that person know that you're here to meet them where they're at, and just remain open to any discussions that they may have. Let them know that, you know, conversations are private, and again, help them just come up with any type of safety plan, or if they need help contacting police and providing that support to them is very important.
Yeah, I've seen numerous cases where other friends or family in particular or coworkers have, in my opinion, done the right thing, and they've reported, you know, abuse to police so that something finally could be done. And that's, I can understand for some people that may be a tough decision, especially if you think, you know, the individual doesn't want you to report it. But I would seriously consider, if you're hearing that there are, you know, specific incidents that recently happened from a law enforcement and prosecution standpoint, you know, if there is a substantial break in time from when an incident happens to when it's reported, there can definitely be evidence that we're just going to not be able to see or record or get a hold of. You know, certainly things like injuries that might heal over time. It's going to be hard for me as a prosecutor to prove a case, for instance, if there were injuries that were present that no longer are. So those are situations where you can see that it's probably serious if you're seeing injuries and there's an evidence standpoint to it that, you know, that may be the right time to contact law enforcement. But I would certainly echo what Laura said of, you know, needing to not be judgmental. Don't minimize the situation either. I think, you know, we see that in a lot of cases with children, or certainly, you know, where children maybe are victims of things like sexual abuse. A lot of times parents or other people will kind of question the child or minimize their experience. And I think sometimes that can happen with domestic violence victims as well. People may try and convince them that maybe it's really not all that bad. I would not suggest to do that, because they're most likely already getting that from their abuser, who's going to be gaslighting them and trying to already convince them that they shouldn't believe what they're, you know, seeing or experiencing, or that they somehow are crazy, that they're the one that's the problem in the situation. So I would really caution, you know, to avoid saying anything that would reinforce that, because they're likely getting it from their abuser already. So yeah, being there for them emotionally, just being a listening ear. Sometimes it's not a matter of necessarily having a specific, all right, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Just be there to listen. But yeah, there are times when it's serious enough that morally you should report it. And sometimes you might have to do that against the wishes or desires of a victim. But if it's serious enough, I think that, you know, I've seen situations where people regretted not reporting things earlier. And just know that, yeah, for you too, as a friend, family, or coworker, you know, you may yourself be an important witness to different communications or things that you've seen. So if police reach out to you to ask for a statement, again, be there for that person and provide that information, because man, that can really help me as a prosecutor to have that additional corroboration, because so often these things happen in the privacy of a home and there may not be other witnesses to it. But even the fact that a victim may have told someone else about it at a certain time and said certain things to them can end up being important evidence to later on combat claims that a victim was just making something up. So there are very important ways that friends, coworkers, and family can definitely be involved in the criminal justice process for domestic violence victims.
Well, thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. If you are interested in resource guides, you can just email me here at the podcast at podcast@mcldaz.org, and we will get the resource guides out to you. Thanks for listening.
This podcast has been a collaboration between the Maricopa County Library District and Office of the Public Defender. Visit us online at mcldaz.org/podcasts to subscribe. To suggest a topic for a future podcast, email us at podcast@mcldaz.org. This podcast provides general information to the public about laws in the state of Arizona and is not intended to serve as legal advice or to establish an attorney-client relationship with listeners. The Public Defender's Office cannot address listeners' specific circumstances. While the Public Defender's Office endeavors to provide accurate information in this podcast, laws can and do change, as does the analysis and application of those laws to specific situations. Therefore, the information contained in this broadcast cannot be guaranteed to be reliable in all situations or for all time. If you are seeking legal advice, the Arizona State Bar provides information about finding a lawyer at azbar.org.